Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. This is Andrea Cates and Sean Moffitt, and we are about to start the Futureproofing Awards for 2020, the nominees session. And let me start off by talking about the topics. We are doing 3 of these all in one day in case you are feeling the Christmas/holiday spirit if you are listening live and want to just listen in all day. We are broadcasting live from snowy Toronto, Canada. And we're going to talk about products, brands, channels, and growth. Today, I'm here, I'm Andrea Cates, and I'm also joined by Sean Moffitt and Joanne, who is all things around the community. And so welcome to the webcast. This is the first of 3 episodes today, and the notion is for us to talk about categories, products, brands, channels, and growth, innovation, plus. And what we're doing today is establishing the foundational principles for what it will take for people to win in 2020 in each of these categories. We have experts with us that will talk about how we look at companies with regard to future-proofing. And for people who don't know our lexicon yet, let me define future-proofing, which is, as we call it, the practice of embracing trends and generating value faster, bolder, simpler, and friendlier than the rest of the industry. So we'll be talking today about this future beyond innovation, which is also the subtitle of the book that Sean Moffitt and I are writing. We are talking about generating future-ready growth, value, and or impact. And so the notion is, how will we measure the success of this future-proofing? And then organizations, companies, and brands that are doing remarkable things. And so what we talk about is the future beyond innovation, which means plus, when there's deep change, there's sustainable impact, there's value beyond just the economics, and where there's a culture that sustains this for a longer term. And so the topics we talk about: brands, products, channels, and growth. And now let me throw it over to Sean Moffitt to talk a little bit about the Futureproofing Awards themselves.
Hey, Andrea, good to have you up here in Toronto. And as you're right, I think we should be having Toronto Mess Sessions in July next year because it's way too cold up here. So thanks. I'm not seeing the deck quite yet, so I'm not too sure what slide we might be on here, but I think we want to talk about the Futureproofing Awards. Today, we've got 3 webinars where we're bringing experts from around the world. I think we're from 12 cities around the world that we're bringing together in terms of nominating some brilliant people that are future proofers. In January, we are going to throw this open to the rest of the world and potentially people that are on the webcast today. And we're going to actually have an open nomination process of people that consider kind of brands in their regular day-to-day lives, or maybe clients or people that they've worked with. And they'll also get the opportunity to nominate a list of future proofers. We'll grab a list of 10 of them by the start of February, and then we'll winnow it down till April when we award the best.
That's great. And so let me introduce the people that will be joining us today. And I'm hoping everyone can see the screen that we're sharing.
Yep.
Great. So first, let me give a quick intro to the 3 people who will be our panel of experts. And we'll do the topics one at a time, but let me just give the overview and give a quick wave. So Doyle Buehler, who's joining us from Sydney, Department Digital, and he's a global digital brand architect. And the notion is, in addition to the book called Breakthrough, that Doyle is an expert in understanding how you take digital brands and make them breakthrough brands. And so we'll be talking with him first about brands in the first part of this, in the first segment. Jim Euchner, who is joining us from New York today. And I love what Jim writes about himself, that, he's passionate about the design of technology to support people at work. I think in the big picture of, who's going to win this war of talent, technology, et cetera, he's got this deep expertise, including expertise in lean startup and large organizations, as well as business model design. And what I love about him too is that he's got a perspective as the journal and editor-in-chief for the Research Technology Management. It's a journal that looks broadly at leaders from corporations that are thinking about innovation and technology really deeply, and has experience with Goodyear, Pitney Bowes, and Verizon, and he'll talk about this from a broad perspective. And then Mark Zawacki, who I met through the Silicon Valley 650 Labs, although he's joining us from Germany today. He is a global worker and insight and thought leader, and has worked in 80 countries. I was looking on the map of where he's been. It's pretty much all over, in industries including healthcare and energy technology, for companies that we would all recognize, like Intel, Union Bank of Switzerland. And something that's intriguing to me is his vertical farming project. So I think we would look at him as an expert overall in organizational transformation. So first, let's talk a little bit about the topics, and each one will have a slightly different deep dive. One is this notion of why this category is important. Of course, we'll start with brands in a minute, but why it's important, not just because it's intriguing, but what really this category contributes overall to growth, value, and impact. The second is to think about some examples, and so we'll be hearing some perspectives from all over the world about who's doing a great job, people who are companies we recognize, as well as maybe some folks in nooks and crannies that we haven't visited, to save us the plane ticket of going there ourselves. We love the fact that this is a global and regional group, and so we value the fact that people have eyes and ears all over the place. And looking at broadly the way that Sean and I like to is, what are some of the forces, and I'll ask Sean to weigh in on this a little bit, this list. You know, what are the forces that are really driving change? Because there are different ways of looking at trends. We don't view ourselves as futurists per se, but we do believe that the early signs of what's happening in today's market are extremely significant for leaders to understand. And so this is all about practical news we can all use. And the thought is, for everyone who's part of the listening group and the community that we're building, is what can leaders really either can, should, might learn from these examples? What are the takeaways? So Sean, let you riff on that a little bit before we get into the first topic.
Well, I think it's interesting we're doing this because, 2020 is oftentimes associated with, laser focus, and we're moving into a new decade. And I think it's never more true that I think we obsess about some of the small changes that are happening week to week, but we totally underestimate how things change over the next 10 years. I mean, if you look back, if we had done this exact webcast in 2010, I'm wondering what type of brands and companies and organizations we would have chosen. Would Uber have been on our list? They might not have even been on our radar screen just quite yet. And so I'm very intrigued, based on our panel and the two panels after them, to see maybe some of the jewels that I haven't even thought about in terms of where we're moving to and what dynamics are driving them.
I'm excited too, and somebody asked me a question the other day, which has really been on my mind, which is, what is the thing that I love the most about work lately? And I think it's really how much I learn every day. I feel like today is going to be a day where we learn a lot from these sessions, and I'm personally in a very reflective mood this time of year about what's coming and some of the questions that we get asked around the world in terms of what the heck's going on in this world and how can we be good leaders. So I'm hoping I can learn quite a bit. So let's jump into the topic of brands, and the structure is as follows. I'll introduce Doyle, who's our resident brand person, and then we'll also open it up to Jim and Mark and Sean and to weigh in on some other topics with regards to brands. So let's jump in, Doyle. Why is this category important? Why do brands matter when it comes to being able to be a leading company, especially in this day and age where some people say that brands are dead, that there is no such value that it used to be of brands. So why is this category so important?
Well, I think what you said, that, yeah, brands are sort of losing some of their significance. I think, though, that there's the shift in place in terms of they're losing the significance from the big brand type thing, and people are finding these small little niche brands around the world that are able to help them solve their problem or help them with the challenge. And I think that's fundamentally what we're talking about with branding, is how do we actually do that? What value is that company offering to their audience that allows them, their customer, to be able to engage in that, to understand their problem, to solve their challenges, and that sort of thing. So fundamentally, that's why we interact. That's why we engage with companies, is we want something from them. And what is that? Well, it's some kind of value. It's some kind of relief. It's some kind of, release of pressure, or whatever the case may be. And that's really what we're fundamentally looking for. So I believe it's one of the most important factors, is what is that brand and how are you delivering it to me as the consumer or as the business to business service provider, whatever the case may be.
Well, I love your expertise, especially when we were just talking a minute ago about what might not have been on our radar 10 years ago and what might be on our radar 10 years from now. So at this very moment, I remember 10 years ago is, should there be e-commerce? You know, is that part of a brand? And questions are quite different now. I think we've answered that one. I'm interested in the intangibles of what brand represents when it's not a kind of household brand. You know, when we're thinking about especially in some places like business to business that are not the sexy side of brand, what are you seeing as really important right now when a business to business or a company with a different kind of business model becomes a brand that we value?
Oh, that's a deep question for 12 a.m. Andrea.
Well, let's start with a company that you like when it comes to a brand. And we'll go back into it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, and I think fundamentally, as I was trying to allude to earlier, a lot of it comes down to that value and you know, that inspiration that we get from them. And fundamentally, again, we're not going to interact with brands that don't provide a fundamental value to us. And that's why, you know, it may not necessarily be a cheapening of brands, but it's really how can we focus in on those brands that are able to provide that. So I think that we're sort of seeing and building more of sort of a relationship specifically with that brand because we're able to understand what they're doing, but doesn't necessarily have to be the Nikes and the, you know, UPSs of the world either. It can be smaller regional type brands that really kind of get the job done from that. So I mean, in terms of a brand itself, there's quite a few. And I when you asked this question, I really wanted to kind of dig deep and see what was sort of in Australia and that sort of thing. And one of the ones that I found is that it's a lot about experience and it's a lot about community, and it's really about tying into, you know, what's really important and what kind of really ties the groups together, the people together. And again, whether you're B2B, this one is a B2C type thing, but vinomofo.com is I'm not sure if it's actually overseas, but it's an Australian based company, and they're really sort of a cheeky wine company, and they're really kind of having fun, and their visuals and their marketing and their overall brand is that we're the cheeky guys, right? We're the people that are going to have some fun out there. We know you love your wine and we want to help you enjoy it as best as possible. So they're really kind of getting that message out there in their promotions and how they're developing that value, that we're just not like an old wine cellar where, you know, you can get your, 50-year-old bottle of red or whatever the case may be. It's about the environment. It's about the community. It's about having fun. It's about, you know, celebrating wine and life and everything else like that. So that'd be one of my first ones.
I like that. And I hadn't heard of it. And it's funny because last week we were judging one of the startup competitions in Copenhagen. And one of the brands that came up, it's not a company yet, but it was a concept, was this notion of, you know, how can we win when we can't win in size, right? Because not necessarily everything that comes regionally is something that can scale to size. I don't know what that is. But one of the things that's, I think, really important is that they had this kombucha company, and kombucha hadn't hit Denmark yet. You know, it's not a thing yet. And so whereas in the Bay Area, it's kind of already a thing, the question was, how do you take something, do you take a brand from somewhere else and literally clone it, copy it, or acquire it? Or do you develop something that's unique to your region and grow it homegrown and develop strength because you have these, as you said, relationships, local attitude, a following, and as you were also saying, this B2B thing, where if you have the distribution locally with the places where people gather, then the product gets inserted. That can be a really strong regional brand, even if it doesn't become the largest global provider, or it could be acquired. So I think it's great. Is there another one that you like, Doyle, in terms of a brand?
Yeah, and just one of the shifts that I'm seeing too is that there is obviously the ability to, even though we're in the digital century, the digital economy, all that good stuff, we're seeing more and more of sort of the companies that are able to group those experiences together. It's not just completely online. It's not just completely offline as well. And one of the other companies that does that, again, another Australian startup, actually from Perth, Australia, where I am right now, is canva.com. And they're a graphics design suite. And back in 2004, 2003, one of the companies I had in Canada, we developed sort of the foundational infrastructure for this type of thing, which is it's a design studio, right? But fundamentally what it does is it allows companies from around the world to be able to create their Facebook images and create PDF documents. And the web and internet and marketing is all visual, right? So if you've got a tool that's actually able to provide that, that's a huge relief for a lot of businesses. And you can share documents, you can share images, you can, use different templates and designs and all that kind of stuff. So they're really building this super strong community of business people that just simply want to get graphics out. And they've created this tool that's just fundamentally fascinating because it gives them that power. It democratizes visual design.
Well, and the other thing about Canva, because they've been getting a lot of news, they've been in the news lately because A, they got so big, B, they're a platform from a different perspective. Usually we think of platforms only in software, but this is a community that was built, and also it's profitable, which is not necessarily the case with all platforms in the, and when did they start? Let's see, 2012, it was founded,
about 2011, 2012, yeah.
Yeah.
They came out of the University of WA, Western Australia.
Well, I love the story too, not just because, is it a female founder?
Yes,
Melanie Perkins, yeah. Because she's the one who's been in the news, and I think that it's really interesting to see the story that she tells of how hard it was to raise funds in the beginning, how many doors she had to knock on. And what I thought was great, I shared this with a friend, is that the way I heard it, at least, she went on some sort of extreme sports outing to try to find some investors, and so she had to learn kite surfing to try to meet the right people to make the right connections. So it's a great story. I'm sure there'll be a movie about it at some point, but yeah, that's a great example. So let me switch a little bit. Let me let Sean do a couple follow-ups as well before we switch to the next topic. Those are really great examples, one smaller and local, and one company that's Australian that started off with a great story and, a true startup story that has grown really huge and has a very loyal following, is profitable, and has a spokesperson who comes off, at least in the press, as a really great kind of today's future-proofing kind of leader.
Yeah, down to earth type person. So
yeah,
I mean, they're taking the tool and it's beyond the tool, right? It kind of looks at the platform, it looks at the people, it looks at the community. How can you actually grow it from there? And fundamentally, that's what brands need today.
Great. Well, let me throw it to Sean. Sean, any follow-up questions before we get to the next topic?
I love the fact that Doyle went local, right? We could have all said, oh, we love Google. Google's such a good, or Amazon. So I'm glad we've gone off the radar screen to two brands that Canva I'm aware of. I was not aware of, was it Vino? Was it
Vino Mofo? Vino Mofo.
For listening out there, but the two I had on my list, and maybe I'll throw it quickly back to you, Doyle, because I think you have an appetite for both brands. I'm a huge sports fan, and I just find of all the sports leagues, I'll probably write another book about this one day, about how slow moving sports is and how locked to tradition they are. I find the NBA is one of those leagues that just says, you know what, we're going to throw the cards up, and whereas most other brands, sports brands, are kind of in entrenched mode and try to get as much out of revenue from TV, NBA is looking at, how do we be big in China? And I know they've had some challenges this year, but just being there in and of itself is important. And even to the point where they've looked at it and said, we don't need an 82 game season anymore. We're going to do a mid-season playoff in the middle of winter so people don't feel like it's the dog days of winter in NBA. So I love their leader, Adam Silver, in terms of just being able to look at a different world and being able to reapply kind of stuff that may work elsewhere. And the other brand I had on my list was Spotify. I love them personally. I use them personally. And I just find, not only as a service, but as a discovery tool and something that's personalized for me, that's the number one tool in terms of how I find new music. So maybe I'll kick those two back to you, Doyle, in terms of whether or not you have some affection for both.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, personalization is a key ingredient of trust. right? And without that, we've sort of seen the shift from everybody trusts everybody online to nobody trusts anybody. So personally, I think we're at this stage of what I call zero trust, right? It's like we have to build it, we have to start it from scratch. So if you're able to do that through personalization, and it's not through, saying your name or whatever the case may be, it's like you said, Sean, it's identifying what's really important to you. And I love Spotify just for that specifically, right? Because you can listen to a song. I Shazam a song, and then I'll go to Spotify and it'll find me like songs that are similar to it. And it's like, oh wow, this is so amazing kind of thing. It pulls the song out of thin air and then tells you what other songs are actually useful. So I actually had that on my list, Sean. I'll let you know that I love that. In terms of sports, like I think that's really important. They need to sort of step outside of what they're fundamentally doing and how they're delivering value. And if that means a half season or splitting the season, I mean, you saw TV programs do that several years ago. They started with they went to the mid-season break and then they continued for another 3 months. So they were able to kind of double the time that people were actually able to watch TV or watch that specific program. So fascinating stuff.
So what I'll do now, I think, Jim, if I'm not jumping too quickly, I think what we'll do is move to channels and let Jim Euchner weigh in on this. And then once again, open it a little bit up. And Doyle, we'll come back to you in a little bit as well for some round robin stuff in a little bit. So Jim, let's start off right away with some of your favorites in the category of channels. Channels is another one of those topics that you're thinking, nobody pays attention to channels. How is channels this really important component of future-proofing? And yet, as you and I know, channels can be some of the most powerful ways that companies bring to scale the innovative ideas that they've got. So what are some of your favorites?
Yeah, okay, let me just start with a few. So Sean, I hate to start with Amazon, but I want to start with Amazon anyway. And the reason is, they're obviously known for really creating the most effective e-tail channel, and starting with books and then moving from there to CDs and then to everything. The thing that I find about them as a consumer, I find it to be a very effective, easy to use channel. But the interesting thing to me was the way Amazon took their channel, their most valuable asset, the eyeballs, their customer base, and they opened it up to their competitors. I know it was a contentious thing even within Amazon to do that, but their logic behind that was customers want more selection than we can provide, and therefore the way to best satisfy the needs of the customers is to open up the channel. And then, to your future-proofing concept of perpetual refresh, they're continually seeking to make everything work better, not just the website, but the experience of delivery and finding things. So, Bezos famously says it's always day one, but their willingness to really step outside of everybody else's assumptions about how things should be done, with opening up the channel, then opening up fulfillment by Amazon, and is, to me, an impressive leveraging of their channel in a way that I think few others would even think about doing.
So I'll jump in and I'll jump in and engage about this for a second, because one of the slides, and Jim, you might have been in the room when I showed this particular slide I've been using for the last couple of months. I think Mark definitely was. There's a slide I used with Jeff Bezos that says, your margin is my opportunity. Yeah. And it usually causes an uproar in the group. It's like people get angry about it. And it's like, look, that's just the way it is. There's no rules about who figures out the best way to establish a business model in any given area. And so it's, the way of looking at it in a positive way is that's fair game. Once you develop a channel that is, like I just keep hearing that DHL and UPS, that Amazon is doing it themselves now. I'm not sure, they're doing a lot more of their own delivery.
They're doing a lot more over the road trucking and so forth. And so, it's everybody who does work with Amazon as one of their partners always needs to be a little concerned.
So a question is, because we talk about this, that in one moment somebody's your channel provider, and the next moment you're competing against them, right? So you're cooperating with them, you're competing with them, et cetera. But so in looking at future proofing specifically, and when we look at people who are, obviously Amazon is one of the big behemoths in this, what is an element of Amazon that even smaller players can learn from?
Well, to me, that their kind of relentless focus on the customer, on, if the customer wants more selection, I'll figure out how to do it. If the customer wants faster delivery, I'll invest in faster delivery. If, pricing is important, I'll invest in that. And so there's sort of that relentless focus on the customer. And then they're willing to think very creatively about their assets, whether it's their channel that we were talking about here, or their infrastructure, whether that's the infrastructure for delivery or their infrastructure for web services. So to me, their view is everything we do, we can turn into a business. And I think that that's a pretty future-proofing way of thinking.
Yeah. Well, let's do another one. What's a second favorite?
So another one, and I have a lot of experience working with larger companies, so I'll take another larger and then a smaller one. So to me, Procter & Gamble is another example. And that probably will strike people a little bit odd. Obviously, they have a very strong supermarket channel. The thing that I found interesting about P&G was their willingness to say, well, how do I leverage that channel? And they're turning to open innovation and connect and develop. So they very aggressively, very systematically across all of their lines of business, went out and looked for products that could work through their brand within the channel, and ran it through their R&D to make things better, ran it through their marketing engine to promote it better, and leveraged their channel to create significant new value for the company. So then again, that was someone saying, look, I have a channel, I know I'm strong there, I want to stay strong, but how do I leverage that to create growth for the company? And to me, that's a really good example. I don't know of others who are using open innovation combined with their channel in quite the way they're doing it.
So I know when Mark chimes in a little bit, he's got a lot of experience in terms of, where does innovation in this future-proofed way reside? Does it inside the company, outside the company, a combination? And we'll get into that, I'm sure. I'm going to ask the same question about this. So imagining that some of the people in our community are not as large as P&G, probably very few companies are. What do you view as one of the forces of change? Because you talked in Amazon about the fact that they're following the customer. What is driving the unique contribution with this open innovation? What's their big why, do you think, at P&G?
I think my view is that they recognize that a lot of people are innovating outside of their walls, the technology-driven innovation, and even the kind of customer-centered and design innovation that they did were not generating enough to move the needle on a company as big as P&G.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people could benefit from that. There's an importance for smaller companies to maintain focus. I get that, but I think that there's an opportunity, and I'll talk about it in the third example too, to sort of leverage more what's happening out in the world. The Swiffer was a combination of things that came from design, from open innovation, in a company in Japan. And so, that willingness to open up the boundaries of your corporate wall, to get people to stop getting locked in. That's a future thinking sort of approach to the world that leverages the channel, which is their biggest asset.
All right, so let's do your third.
My third harks back, I think, to Canva and to kite surfing and to communities. And it's a company called Threadless, which many of you may have heard of. It's a t-shirt community. And so their channel is their community. The people who are part of it design the t-shirts. The people who are part of the community vote on the t-shirts and decide which ones will be produced and which ones won't be produced. And they're the customers. They buy the t-shirts. And I came across them twice. One, I work with people at Eric von Hippel at MIT, and he really studies user innovation and users who innovate. And this community really is enables a bunch of designers to innovate in the space of t-shirts. And then also, I worked at Pitney Bowes at the time. They ship a boatload of t-shirts at that time, and it must be up from there. They were shipping 10,000 a month, and that's years ago. And they were innovating around our postage meters because our postage meters didn't meet their needs, so they hacked the postage meters too. So it's not the secure parts of them, but the usability parts of them. So I think the key though is this idea of community, which is a brand concept. It's a channel concept. It's a design concept. It's interesting the Canva person managed kite surfing, because kite surfing design is now done almost entirely by a user community. So anyway, so the community as channel is the third, I would say.
Really interesting. Well, just in the interest of time, I'd like to get Mark to weigh in on the next topic, and then we'll have some more conversation around the fourth topic for a round robin and some Q&A. Growth is two things. It's number one, an output of all the things we've already talked about, because a lot of people view growth as an endpoint in and of itself, although that's not the only way to judge success. But growth is certainly something that is one of the first topics, because that whenever we get into conversations about future proofing, the goal isn't to be innovative. The goal is to be able to grow your company, bring things to scale. So Mark, in your words, because your perspective as an expert in, I would call it transformation, and definitely this global perspective, what are the themes around growth that you think are so important for us to think about as we go into this 2020?
Thanks, Andrea. So, I would start by, when I look at businesses from a first principles perspective, all roads do lead to growth. We innovate because we want to grow, or we do a big cultural change program because we hope our people are more higher performing and we can grow. We launch new products so we can grow. We do an organizational transformation or a digital transformation so we can grow. In my mind, everything's wired back to growth, and it's been more fashionable lately to add CSR elements to that, which are fine. Capital markets work on growth, right? We put $1 in, or let's say we put $100 into something, be it a startup or be it a very mature company, and at some future date we want more than $100 back out. Now that startup's going to be a riskier endeavor, but in each option I just gave, growth is the metric, right? We don't get the $100 back if those businesses do not grow. And so that's the first thing to say. I suppose the second comment is it's extraordinarily difficult. There was some research published by Rita McGrath. She was at Columbia at the time. Now she's at NYU, but she published in HBR back in 2012 something called the Growth Outliers. She went into FactSet. She grabbed approximately 5,000 companies with at least $1 billion US in revenue, and the results were pretty shocking. She took out all the M&A and inorganic growth, as we call it, and looking only at organic growth, she determined that only 8% of large organizations around the world could grow by 5% per annum for 5 consecutive years. 92% of these large organizations aren't growing by a pretty simple measure. You push that out to 10 years, and only 0.5% could grow by 5% per year organically over a 10-year period. So it's incredibly hard to grow. And we began to peel that onion, and the short answer is it's a structural problem. The day-to-day business, which is very short-sighted around this quarter's result, is really built for predictability, reliability, stability, and it's got its eye on this quarter. We're closing this year up soon around the world. Thought it was on mute. And then January 1st, we'll start thinking about the second quarter, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we're seeing, the big trend, the big aha now is we're seeing organizations starting to kind of morph or split into two. I've got this old legacy business. I'm going to continue to turn the crank on it. But out here on the edge, I'm going to go see how many new $1 billion, €1 billion, take your denominator, how many new businesses I can build on the outside to replace what we believe to be, long, slow decline businesses that are ticking over in the low single digits. And so this is a trend. It's a pretty early emerging trend, but we're starting to track a couple dozen companies around the world, big companies that are really trying to grok this model of so-called core edge. So they believe that it's hard to grow in that traditional industrial age pyramid for lots and lots of reasons. So they're trying to break out growth engines on the edge, as it were.
So give us some examples, because this is where I love the fact that I believe your perspective. I think everyone on the panel today, you are future proofers. You see ahead of what a lot of people are not caught up with.
Sure.
So what are some companies that we should be paying attention to in this growth area?
Look at AXA, the AXA Insurance, the giant multinational Paris-based insurance group. 135,000 people. They historically been in a pretty slow growth industry. They have headwinds and risks on their business. They're saying, the risk profile of insurance is changing. People are healthier, they're living longer. That's going to affect premiums in the health insurance space. Cars are becoming safer. That's going to affect motoring insurances. And they said, we have 135,000 people. There's no evidence we can change them. There's no consultant that showed us a proposal on how to evolve or change that many people. So let them go turn the crank on the existing business. And out here on the edge, on the outside, we're going to create a new business unit. This is called AXA Next, N-E-X-T. And they very cleverly put all of the tools of growth under a single CEO, reporting only to the board. This is all what I call buy, build, partner, and invest activities. So buy, they have a budget of up to €1 billion a year to buy anything high growth that they think will accelerate their new business ideas. Build says, look, there's 30 or 40 things we could go build in the insurance space, but instead of relying on an accelerator or something, let's build them ourselves. Let's get the right people to join these teams. Let's give them equity. So, a corporate exec can leave their job and go do one of these startups. By the way, you're going to be working on startup wages, and in return, I'm going to give you equity. So, entrepreneur is a French word, but let's see if our corporate execs are real entrepreneurs and are going to take a haircut on salary for equity. And that's been a wildly successful program. And what's really interesting to us is how all of those activities are tied together, and all four of those levers, buy, build, partner, and invest, are under a single executive, so they can make the right trade-offs. And so they're integrating all of those growth tools under a single entity, run by Guillaume Brody in Paris. Another one I'd point you to is AIA Insurance. They were a typical healthcare insurer, and they've evolved into the wellness and prevention space, and it's one of the fastest growing companies right now in North America. A third one I'd point you to is Ørsted, which is an energy group based in Copenhagen. And Ørsted's the old Dong business for those that know the Nordic space. And what Ørsted did was, they were only 5 years ago, they were 90% domestic, and they were 90%, let's call it black, coal and traditional energy sources. And in 5 short years, they've reshaped their entire portfolio. So now they're 90% international, and they've just, in the last 6 months, gone 100% clean, 100% green. So they've completely shifted their portfolio. It's unlocked a tremendous amount of growth, and they're in the high teens in terms of annual growth rate, CAGRs, compound annual growth rate, based on this new strategy. So Ørsted in the energy space here in Europe is really exciting. And then a fourth one I would suggest is a Swiss company that PMI. You'll probably know their product Marlboro cigarettes, but Philip Morris Inc. PMI we call it. And they said they're getting out of the cigarette business. Cigarette consumption globally is in free fall. It's dropping by 3 to 5% per annum across the board. If you look at any major market where cigarettes are consumed, and they and this is all these cases are public information. You can find them online if you look. But what the leadership team at Philip Morris has said is we're going to go into the healthcare space. We're literally going to reinvent the entire portfolio to go into the healthcare space, and they have an incredibly sound proposition how to do that. And I suspect they're not going to call it Marlboro Healthcare, mind you, but what they're
Yeah.
what they basically said is, look, we work with 500,000 farmers around the world that sell a high quality a high margin agricultural product, and based on the location of and climates of where tobacco is grown, what other high margin agriculture products can be grown there that are actually helpful and have a medicinal value or supplement value, etc. And what's interesting is because this industry historically has been highly regulated, one of the core competencies they have is actually product traceability. So you buy a pack of Marlboro cigarettes anywhere in the world, and they can tell you what hectare of land that was grown on, and when the crops were the leaf was extracted, where it was manufactured, what herbicides and pesticides went on that. So they're going to have product traceability now, not on tobacco products, but on health-related products. It's just fascinating, and the early signs on how that's growing are quite phenomenal. They've already started. They're kind of they're not releasing the figures on that. I've been privy to what those plans are, and it's quite remarkable. So AIA, AXA, Orsted, and PMI were 4. I was going to mention Google and Netflix. Netflix is growing extraordinarily well right now, primarily through their own content and also international. But I mentioned Google. We all know Google, of course, but I mentioned it because there was a very telling article that came out just in the last couple of weeks, and it has to do with this core edge model that I described earlier. Who's arguably the best investor, the growth investor in the last 50 years? People would say Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway. And if we remember about 3 or 4 years ago when Google organizationally changed to Alphabet, the holding company, and Google, the AdWords was just a business unit under this, conglomerate-like structure. Conglomerates are kind of back in vogue again. The article that was in the press last month said Google's inspiration for that was Berkshire Hathaway, and Sergey, Larry, and Eric all flew out to Omaha and met with Warren Buffett and his team, and they said, how do we structure Google to be like Berkshire Hathaway? And it's a very simple model. It's like Berkshire Hathaway, now Google, is saying at the center, at the core, is a pretty small organization, and all we're going to do is very efficiently deploy capital to high growth businesses that may be independent from each other, because that way we're going to build a portfolio of high growth companies. And the traditional assumptions that these need to be interlocked or interrelated may go by the wayside, and we may need to rethink, some traditional assumptions we had that, gee, there must be synergies. Maybe not. The world's most prolific investor in terms of getting growth has a portfolio of unrelated assets.
Well, I think that this is not just, one of the things that we talked about before this whole session started was we will definitely run out of time before we run out of topics. I think that what you're talking about, and I'll extract a little bit of this notion of some of the leadership tips. The traditional thinking is that you have to know what your core capacity or your core capabilities are. That's pretty much out the window. The notion of specializing and having everything within the 4 walls and executing, and also trying to get people to have a mixed focus. This core edge thing kind of challenges that traditional thinking. The notion of, stick with your knitting. which is something that we all learned, at least I learned when I was, in strategy, the corporate strategy was that's outside of our core competency. Well, it might still be very important in the portfolio, even if you can't figure out a way to connect all the dots. And I think the fourth thing is all of these really interesting flips. I was not familiar with PMI and this strategy. I think that had you told me that it was two truths and a lie, that would have been the one I'm like, yeah, that's not true. But the fact that that's happening, I think is really inspiring. So as I said, this is the way to introduce the thinking for these categories. I am going to open it up for a little bit of a round robin because we have about 15 more minutes. But I think rather than trying to delve deep into every single topic, I think it would be great for each of you to have, like in a debate, you have a rebuttal. Like, okay, so what did you just hear that you really want to say something about? I can see Jim has something to say. Jim, so Jim, what are your reactions to this whole conversation?
First, I'm very inspired by what you were saying, Mark, and I do believe in the idea that when people talk about trying to both innovate and operate at the same time, I think people have found it's a myth to think that it's going to be done within the same entity. It just doesn't. The core dominant business model squeezes out the new, unless you're really leveraging a core asset. So I think the real challenge when you make that structural separation, what Tushman calls structural ambiguity, when you make that is how do you leverage the assets that you have in your core business in order to make it even more successful. So I actually disagree, Andrea, with your comment that the idea of core capabilities is out the window. And I'm not so certain that that conglomerates with no synergies will fare much better this time around than they did the last time around. But we'll see. We'll see. I do think that successful businesses will have to navigate, will have to do some structural separation, but we'll have to think carefully about what that relationship is between the two businesses and manage accordingly. That's I'm
excited. I am actually really excited to see. I think we're in a bit of a transition now as well. And I'll qualify one thing without sounding defensive, which I know it will sound, but my qualification is that at least the traditional what are you good at used to be a little bit narrow. I think if the question were asked to Amazon, what are you good at? And it was books, they would never be shipping. They would never have AWS, right? I mean, that's not the way that my original definition, but not to sound defensive. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, and Jim, just to go back and forth on this a little bit, when we watch these edge organizations being set up, they're being very deliberate about keeping it at arm's length. And, if you picture two circles, the core and the edge, keeping them separate and keeping them apart. And the emerging thinking is maybe never bring them back. And, we can have the debate 30 years ago, conglomerates, they were borrowing on too much cheap capital and ultimately they crashed, right? Airlines are buying hotels and vertically integrating all this. But think about this. Because organizations will tell me, Mark, we're building some stuff on the edge, and when it starts to scale, we're going to, quote, bring it back in. And I'm actually seeing a rejection of that thesis. Think about this. Why would you take a high growth asset on the edge and bring it into a low growth environment with those very operators you described that have never, in fact, managed a high growth asset?
I'm agreeing with you. I would use one of your examples as to illustrate my point, the example of PMI. They have a core asset. It's relationships with farmers. It's the ability to trace product, high value product, et cetera. Leveraging that asset requires a very careful negotiation between the two circles, even if they're managed differently. There's going to have to be some way in which that asset is shared and managed. But I think that's a great strategy because it leverages an asset and it enables them to have a chance of success.
So I'm going to jump to Doyle and just ask for anything that you've been dying to say in not rebuttal, but it's not really a debate, but sort of, now that we've all said some things, what are your kind of parting thoughts about the topics and what's important in terms of future proofing in any of the categories that we talked about?
Oh, that's another great question, Andrea.
I know it's late at night. Well, let's just put it this way. Anything you wanted to respond to in terms of what Jim or Mark said, maybe that's an easier
I was
one.
quite fascinating, actually, Mark, when you were talking about the level net growth of 5%. I think it was for 8% of companies that are able to sustain it. Was that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So I was just curious, like, how do we actually magnify that? How do we amplify that? Were there critical factors that, I think you might have said some of them, but really sort of what was the underlying reason that we weren't getting there, or those that were there were doing that?
Those that could achieve the 5% growth for 5 years in a row, and that was 8%. But if you put the clock out to 10 years, that drops to 1/2 of 1%.
Yeah.
But there was some patterns. Number one, there was stability in the leadership team. We weren't bringing a new CEO. We brought a new CFO. Every couple of years. There was a stability in the management team. Number one. Number two, they were quick to make some early bets. So they were really into experimentation. Let's go try some things. They weren't resting on their laurels. Number three, they were using that portfolio of newer high growth things to replace the declining revenue in the core. They were very acquisitive, but they weren't making big bets. Again, they were doing smaller tuck-in acquisitions, and they were quite often doing those in new markets as a point of entry, thinking I'm going to buy something small and then figure out how to scale it quickly. That was really a summary of what the lessons learned were from those 8% that could grow for 5. Yeah.
So making it easy to do a sort of quick summary, Doyle.
Yes.
Anything of what you just heard, either remind you of a highlight from what happened in 2019, or it's something that inspires you to look forward to 2020.
Well, I would say that typically what we need to look at is personalization of the brand, or creating trust. Rather, we have to start building that trust. And for brands that are willing to do that, that's where they're going to see sort of more uptake. Trust comes through personalization, privacy, and permission. And in a lot of cases, a lot of businesses are failing. So I see that this is what's going to be sort of one of the big milestones coming up in 2020, is how to actually businesses look at a strategy for trust in the digital space.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists. We were absolutely 100% sure that this would be interesting. Check, check, check. We were absolutely 100% sure that we would run out of time. Check. And we would look forward to the conversations, because we'll be using this guidance to help find some other companies that we would consider for the awards. And hopefully we've established some relationships with all of you to help us be part of this community of looking around the world for who is an example of doing all of these categories well for the award. So thanks to the panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Sean to help close us out. So thank you very much, Mark and Jim and Doyle.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating discoveries, guys. I love it when I feel like I'm versed on a topic, and then I get around a group of other minds that actually open my mind up to a couple of different things. So I do one thing that'll be interesting, I find, and maybe I'm speaking as a Canadian here, where both of these are actually disproportionately more Canadian, and kind of the disappointment of growth. And I don't know how many brands I would put under the Future Proofing Awards in these two categories. I'm curious to know where they go in the future. One is the legalization of cannabis, which is generally becoming a global concept and probably a very scalable concept. I don't think anybody has knocked that one out of the ballpark yet. And blockchain, and I was one of them. I was there from the start going, this is going to be a transformative technology. I think we put it on our list as the third most important technology. By and large, I find that it's kind of been a little bit disappointing as a category, and certainly entrance within the category. So that would be maybe our follow-up contribution a decade from now. Who won that battle? I know we may have some Q&A later, but just a quick tour de force in terms of what's happening. We will have an open platform built come January that you will be able to nominate your own faves. And so that's what's going to be happening over the holidays. And so here's how it runs. Hopefully we'll have some open nominations come in. We'll judge those. We'll interview some of the finalists, and then declare the winners in April. So stay tuned on the Futureproofing Awards. It was interesting. Mark, I definitely want to get you back into something that we do, because one of the declared missions of Futureproofing Next this year is to look at 4 different foresight ventures. I know our Future of Work one is going right now, and there's about 35 dedicated, passionate people that are mining the world of what does the workplace look like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. We're going to do some stuff on AI. Any sports fans out there, we are going to do a how does technology meet sport, and where is it all going to go? But very intriguingly, the scale and growth stuff that you were talking about, definitely need to tap into your brain at some point in the future. Myself and Andrea have been crowded into an Airbnb over the last couple of days amidst snowy Toronto, trying to finish and grind out the last 2 innings of our book. So, you know, we're launching February 10th, so shameless self-promotion here, but I think a lot of the things that we're talking about on this webcast certainly factor into our orientation about where is this world going innovation.
And just saying, we started off with a one-on-one basketball, which was not part of my plan, but thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I thought you'd buy no comment. I thought,
yeah, no comment. Moving on.
We are anointing come January a set of 66 kind of, I guess we'll call them our guild, if you will, and hopefully they can function both selflessly for themselves and for the good of the collective in terms of an expert network and some collaborative stuff that we've got that we want to get into. We are doing 2 other webcasts today. So for those that are listening, even our panelists, we're going to talk about experience engagement, tech, and platforms next, about an hour from now. And then we're also going to talk about business models, ecosystems, talent, and transformation later in the day. All of these over the next 2 days will be online at futureproofingnext.com at Futureproofing Now. We've got our 2 January topics already picked out. Myself and Andrea are doing kind of a State of the Union 2020, and then AI later in the month. And then just from an overall question standpoint, and maybe I'll throw it out to all of you, just because I think all of you have a piece of this. Technology, you know, I think we all hear the headlines about AI. With your respective categories, you know, I can't imagine somebody emerging over the next decade that doesn't have some type of technology embedded into what they're doing. I guess I'll just throw it out to all of you in the last minutes that we have in terms of, you know, how does that factor into each one of your different categories?
I'll make a comment. I hope that the power of AI is used by people to make work better and customer experiences better, as opposed to just being used for automation and efficiency.
Bravo. A nicer, friendlier, non-evil version of AI.
Yeah, I think we are at a place in time when work does not have to be productive work, does not have to be as routinized and standardized and automated as it has in the past in order to be profitable. So we'll see how that leads, but I think you know, I have a hope that we won't just turn toward the use of AI to displace people, but the use of AI to make work better.
Nice.
And on that point, yeah, on that point, I mean, I think it's important to understand too that despite being, you know, the tech revolution or whatever that you want to call it, we have to look as a business, as a brand, how do we actually build a foundation with the tech? It's not just a fad, because if you're looking at it as something short term, it's a fad, it's going to be gone, it's going to disappear. If you sort of look at how can you integrate that technology into a foundation of the business, like some of these examples that I talked about, that's where the businesses are going to see the success.
And Mark, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, real quick, from a growth perspective, I would give 2 counterintuitive thoughts on technology. One is that it's largely commoditized. If every bank in the world is working on distributed ledger or blockchain, who's going to get competitive advantage from it, right? They're all working on it. It's all commoditized. We can read about it. So it's commoditized. Secondarily, you don't have to be first. I think all of the companies that create massive value, massive growth, weren't actually first, right? Before Google, we had about a dozen search engines, and before the iPhone and Android, we had Motorola, Nokia, and RIM, and before Airbnb, we had Gîtes de France. And Gîtes de France has been happening for 40 years in France, right? So you don't have to be first with this technology. You can actually lag 10, 20, 30 years and just build something better, where those that first launched that technology just did a lousy job with it.
Well, I'm going to close us out. This was much more interesting than even I had thought. It was examples that I hadn't heard of, which I feel like I'm usually a big fan of all of these topics, and I learned a lot. I found myself having a lot of ahas, this notion of what resonates in a local community. Especially, I have this fear that size, like China wins this battle and another geographic region wins this other battle. But I think some of the themes of, being local can still have huge power, and the notion of an energy company that has a huge regional footprint that becomes a global player changes, people who change their direction and do it successfully. And it not just because they're big to begin with. I think that this is very inspiring to me in terms of the leadership message that we keep hearing people need desperately, which is, what do we do in 2020? How do we as company X move forward and think differently so that we can have new opportunities to grow and add value and have impact? And I'm super excited. I think this was an amazing panel, and I love the diversity of all of your opinions. And thank you so much for being opinionated, bringing so much richness to the conversation. So thank you so much. And when we close, we stop the session, and we unfortunately can't stay on the line, but we'll write to you, because as we record this, we like to have kind of a clean ending. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.